don't leave instantly after the talk. I think we can then ask questions, and also Danilo will be there to answer them. We will be recording. Actually, it started now. So I hope everybody's fine with this. If not, I think the only option is to leave, but I hope that you will stay. And we will publish the talk then later on, on the Meetup page. So thanks a lot. And I will give the word to Evident.
Yeah, so I will share my screen if that's okay with you, Peter. Then I'll just do a quick introduction of who we are. Let me see. You should see my screen now.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I will tell a little bit about who I am and who we are as a company. I'll keep it short because we all want to hear what Danilo has to say. So this is me. I'm Joost van der Land. I was born in the Netherlands, but I moved to Portugal a couple of years ago. And I'm a technical director at Evident. My background is in development, mostly backend languages like Java and test automation. So not a lot of Angular exposure, although in the recent years, a lot of the complexity has moved to Angular. And well, I'm a big fan of TypeScript, so that makes life easier for me at least. So I've been leading Scrum teams for a few years now, and at Evident, I'm responsible for the technologies we use and the people we have to build our projects. Evident is a company that originated in the Netherlands. We have an office in Utrecht, but we also have an office in Lisbon since a couple of years. That's mostly a technology-focused hub, where a lot of our developers are currently. Our mission statement is to help B2B companies grow in an ever-changing digital world. That is a little bit of a marketing slogan, but it is true, especially the B2B part. So we focus on companies doing business with other companies. And the fact that it's B2B results in more complex interactions with end users, which is also interesting for front-end technologies. And we build long-lasting partnerships with our clients, and build the platform together with them. So we're building e-commerce platforms and platforms where you can do services, so service portals. These are some of our clients. They're international clients who do business globally. Some of their headquarters are located in the Netherlands, but we've also starting to get clients from Sweden and from Germany and are spreading our wings across Europe. Look at our company. We're currently with about 100 employees, about 60-40 between Portugal and the Netherlands, and 80% of them is engineer. The other 20% is overhead, like myself. You don't really need them until you need them. If you look at this picture, it's our Christmas event. So obviously the last year was quite hard on us, or on everybody, and we had to move towards a remote way of working. But I think it really shows the culture we have. So everybody really put effort into staying connected and bonding, and we see that as a success factor in our success in our projects. So we really focus on the culture. We would like to get back to this as soon as possible. So having events face to face, like our winter event where we go skiing with the company, or doing things on the beach in Portugal. I don't think we should do a lot of things on the beach in the Netherlands. Portugal's a slightly better location. The things we do with Angular is we build commerce applications with Angular. So we have a commerce engine which provides a REST API, and we use an Angular front end to render the UI. And since the domain we are in requires complex interactions, this Angular application is also quite complex, with a lot of state management going on, a lot of integrations with other systems. And that's also part where Danilo is going to talk about how you optimize that using memoization. We are always looking for talent, and we currently have some active openings for the next front-end Angular hero. So please check out our website to see the career path. And then I would like to give the word to Danilo.
Yeah, thank you. Let me share my screen. Basically just a browser window. You should see the presentation now. That's good. So today we're going to be talking about NGRX selector memoization and why you should do it. And basically this is our agenda. So first we're going to talk about memoization, what it is. And then we're going to talk about NGRX selectors. And then basically how NGRX selectors actually implement memoization. And then afterwards, I have prepared a couple of examples. So a broken Angular application, and we're going to fix it gradually and showcase all of the common problems that you also might encounter in your day-to-day programming life. And maybe at the end, if you're still having space in your head, then we're going to do some real customization of memoization with NGRX selectors. So about me, I'm Danilo. I have a Java and C++ background for about 8 years. So I am originally a backender, but since about 4 years ago, I started working with Angular. So not really Angular JS, it was Angular 4, I guess, which we started with. And yes, so currently I'm working at Evident. Started about 4 months ago. So let's dive into it. First topic, what is memoization? Well, let's go with definition here. In computing, memoization is an optimization technique used primarily to speed up computer programs by storing the results of expensive function calls and returning the cached results when the same inputs occur again. So basically, if we already know the result because of the inputs haven't been changing, we just don't compute the result again, but return instead the cached results. And one of the prime examples in computer science for expensive functions, it is Fibonacci. So let's talk about how we can calculate Fibonacci numbers. So I prepared a example application in StackBlitz. So later on, you can get all the links and see all the examples and explore them by yourselves. So if we're going to calculate the Fibonacci numbers, most of you should already know what Fibonacci numbers are. Basically, we're using them for pointing in with our stories if we're doing Scrum. And the Fibonacci sequence itself is defined as the first two numbers are 1, and every other number is the sum of its two predecessors. So if we're going to implement it like I did here, this is a massive recursion going on. So basically, if the value is less than 2, so for 0 and 1, we just return 1. And in the other case, we are recursing on ourselves to get the result. So, and as you can see here on the right side, so I added some additional code here to, basically get the calculation time. You can see that the calculation for number 45 takes 12 seconds to actually calculate. And the question is, can we actually do better? And yes, of course we can, because Fibonacci themselves is a pure function. So the Fibonacci number, the 45th Fibonacci number will always have this value. So I can cache it, right? And caching can be done as simply as by wrapping this whole function, as you see here on the commented out code here, just with memoize. So a low-dash helper that will basically wrap the whole function in a cached context and will only execute this function here if the input will change. So now I can just restart the timer. Seems like I can't because I broke something. So let's refresh this page. You know, live coding. So now basically I have the memorize function wrapping this whole Fibonacci sequence, and it is also, by the way, it is defined included in the memorize in the recursion itself. So as you can see, computation doesn't take any more time. I can even go really crazy and start calculating from the top from 200, and you can see it just doesn't really need time at all, because I have effectively removed the whole recursion in, so the double recursion at least. So there's only a simple recursion left. If we put in a console log on what is actually being computed, you can see here, it will just compute all 45 numbers, 45 numbers at the beginning, and then afterwards use cached results for all of the further output. So yeah, memoization can actually help us in our day-to-day lives. So let's go over to the next, which is NGRX selectors. And NGRX selectors are part of the NGRX state management. So basically, they are the window to our world of the NGRX store. And NGRX, as you probably all know, has this unidirectional data flow. So I am here in the component, and whenever I want to interact with my application, I dispatch a couple of actions. Those actions are then used to trigger side effects to fetch some data from a third-party API. And of course, actions also are used in combination with reducers to compose the next store object. And then selectors actually select a slice from this big store object and make it usable for our components. So selectors not only select slices here, but they can also improve data, reformat data, accumulate data from different places and put them all together into one place, so that basically my component can efficiently render all of the data. And because of that, selectors also have to be memoized. So they have to reduce the number of updates that are actually being triggered downwards to the component. Because if the component detects a change in the data, it will do some DOM manipulation. And those are really expensive calculations in the browser. So we really don't want to do them if nothing really has semantically changed on our front end. So actually optimizing and having an eye on the selector memoization is really important in our applications. So this is basically what I just said. Yeah, I haven't forgotten anything. So how does this actually look? So let's have a look and develop the idea of what a selector is actually doing. And let's go back to the same application again. And here I have an example. I guess we can have a look at it in a new window with the browser DevTools. Basically, I have an example here that it has a store in the back end or in the front end of, you know, it has an NGRX store, which contains 3 books. Every book has a title, description, a published date, and is also referencing authors and texts by ID. All of the books are kept in an entity store, as you can see from the format here. So it has IDs and it has entities. And then also texts and authors are also NGRX entity states, and they contain the real data. So basically, if I want to look up what the tag ID PH is, I have to go to the text entity store And here I can see its philosophy. That's actually not a far-fetched example. So, you know, for this talk, I needed a somewhat elaborate example with some stores to actually showcase some shortcomings and some errors of you can do while doing memoization. And this format of this normalized data, basically that my main entity, the book, is just doing an ID reference to the tag. It's not really far-fetched. This is also basically how the WordPress API is working. So there you have your blog posts. Those blog posts have tags. Those blog posts have authors. And all of the references are just by ID. So you can't really get the blog post in total with all of its content so that you can just render it. You really have to go to different endpoints in the API to actually accumulate all of the data. So yeah, that's basically why this example here. And another thing, also for this example, I have added a button here, which generates a random tag and then attaches this tag to a book. So if I click it, I have 2 more updates being shown. Basically, I have an action which has this random tag. And then I have an action which includes or adds the tag to the tag IDs of the specific book. So again, this is not just an example. Normally you would do this like in a transactional context as one action so that it either happens or it doesn't happen at all. So, but here, just for example, and for a simplified example, basically, I have modeled it like this. Yeah, we won't need all of this for the first showcase. Just for later showcases, I will reuse this example. And so, yeah, now that you know what I'm talking about. So let's go back to the example here. So basically, my store object is just an observable. And if we go to the introduction component here, I can just take the store object and subscribe to it in the template and just render it out. So what you see in your DevTools is basically just printed out here. So how would I go about selecting something from here? Well, if it's an observable, then it supports pipe. Then I can do a map and then navigate myself further into the data. So if I go to the bookstore, for example, so the slice of books, the data gets reduced to just the entity store of the books. Now then, of course, I can have entities. And let's say I just want to have the first book. Now I just have all of the data for the first book. So, but what happens now if I add random tag to the book? Well, there is no memoization. As you can see here, I will always have 2 updates. So basically the updates is just a scan on the observable here, which accumulates how often this observable is emitting something. So for every click of the button, I have 2 more updates that are actually being pushed to the front end. So this is actually what I want to get rid of if I'm using memoization, right? Because as you can see, only this update of actually adding the tag to the book is something that interests me. I'm not interested in the action that a tag is added to the tag store. And even sometimes if a tag is added to another book, this currently doesn't interest me in this book. So I can go ahead and say, I know my RxJS. I can do just distinct until changed. And basically we're done, right? So 1 click must have been another book that the tag was added to. This 2, this 2. Now I got 1 and only 1 update and just the update of that I'm actually interested in. Sounds plausible, right? Well, this is exactly what select is doing. So instead of writing map here, I can just write select and remove this. And exactly the same behavior. So because select under the hood is also just doing a distinct until change on the mapped value. Select actually is pretty powerful. This is something that I didn't knew before this meetup. So I can also just go ahead and do a selection like this. So selecting the bookstore, I'm selecting the entities, and of course the first book. And it's memoized. So only the changes that actually are interesting to this part of the data actually get sent to the front end. Of course, all of this is not really reusable, right? So we are not yet there. Most of you, when working with NGRX, know the create selector nomenclature or the way of defining NGRX selectors. Yeah, so because every time I'm doing a basic full scan of my operators or of my navigation here, I am dependent on the whole store. And what I really want to have is just a selector that can be changed independently in the background, maybe if some refactoring is happening. And my components themselves don't actually see this change because they're just, yeah, the selector is fetching the data from a different point in the whole store object. I'm not really interested where. This is what a selector should be like. So it should be reusable. So that's why normally we have like selectors for getting all of the books. So get books, for example, and we're using the create selector. Create selector always has at least one input. In our case, it's the application state. So as app state. And then the selector does the first navigation to the entities, for example. So s.book. And of course, also a projector function as a projector function, which a selector has also only one. And now I use this with select and get books. And now I have again the same books object. And now I can go ahead. So I now have this as a reusable selector. Basically, herein is encoded the whole where actually this slice of the state is from. And now I know I have a dictionary of books. And now I can write another selector that actually does the individual lookup. So in our case, getting the first book. So for example, we have a const get book, which is a create selector that is based on get books. And now we have the dictionary and we're doing the lookup. So dict of first element. And now we're using this selector. And we end up with the same object. Also memoized, so events that don't concern this selector won't get recognized by it, and it's not triggering view updates. So yeah, that's basically how you normally use selectors, right? And as you can see, they basically derive from just map functions. So even if I have this here, I can, again, just use it as a map function. So for example, I can have store pipe. Now I have the map. Here I get my application state, and I can just use get book on the state. And see, I've lost the memoization, but still the output is the same. I've lost the memoization because I am here using the selector as a function, so it's getting created over and over again for every object. So this is why I'm losing the memoization here. But apart from that, from function-wise, it's still the same map function. So let's go with this example. And let's go further in the talk. So as you have seen, we can use create selector. Create selector has at least one input, so it can have multiples, so which are basically the first arguments of create selector. And then at the end, we have exactly one projector function that is used to calculate the output of the selector using the inputs from all of the first arguments. And as you've also seen, create selector provides memoization by default if I'm using it correctly. So if you're just the driver of the car, this is basically all you need to know. But you know, we're mechanics. We are going to have a look under the hood. So what actually happens when we call create selector? Well, this happens. Create selector, as returned, we have a memoized selector or memoized selector with props. And it uses create selector factory with default memoize to create this output. So create selector factory by itself is a function that takes a memoize function to produce a function that outputs memoized selectors. And memoize function by itself is also a function that uses a projector function to create a memoized projection which adheres to this data type. Those properties are basically only used for testing. And all of the heavy lifting of the actual memoization is being done in the memoized function again. So there's a lot of functions. That's I think it's a really good architecture because that makes it really good customizable. And you don't really need to know all about this. Basically, what you need to know about is that default memoize, which you have seen in the beginning, is actually implementing the memoize function. So what we can actually do is instead of using create selector, we can use create selector factory with default memoize. So let's have a look and let's do that. So here, create selector factory, default memoize. Guess this one. So nothing happened, same behavior, because I'm just doing what's being done under the hood. So to actually customize our memoization, we have to expand this part a bit. And we are giving default memoize the projector. So this basically is the implementation of what a memoize function was, right? So we're just basically expanded this one to this nomenclature, basically. So still same behavior, only updates when relevant data is changed. Random number generator was hitting all the other books. So, and now I have a way to actually customize default memoize. So for example, you can see here, it's a first argument is projector function. Second argument is a function is arguments equal, and third argument is a function is results equal. So let's just for kicks go and do something like this. So we say for get book, my inputs are always the same. So by customizing it, I can also just break it, right? So the way I'm clicking here, at least one of them should have, one of the texts should actually have been added here, right? So, but I told the memoization all of the arguments are true, so obviously it doesn't do any more calculation. I can see that actually texts are being added if I just revisit this page again, so that the selector is being resubscribed, and then here I can see something has happened. So if something like this happens in your application, so that you expect something to happen on the output, but nothing happens there, but if you do some action, maybe you click on a button, reload this component, and then something shows up, this could be a memoization problem, right? So let's have a look. How is default memoize doing this under the hood? And here I actually thought about creating a diagram and or some flowchart of some point, but you know, it's just easier to actually have a look in the code itself. So this you have already seen. Default memoize is basically taking a projector function, and then we have two functions for is arguments equal or is results equal. Both of them default to an is equal check, which actually is not a deep equal, but just a identity check, basically. So for primitive data types, this works all fine. So if there's just strings, booleans, numbers, the triple equals will actually be what the actual value is. So 2 and 2 are equal. But if we're having complex objects here, this triple equals is actually an identity check. So not a deep equal, but an identity check. So this is why, and one of the reasons why we really should pay attention on doing everything in a memoized, in a immutable fashion in our application. So if we're doing mutable changes, those identity checks won't work again. So always pay attention to this. So let's get back to default memoize. The first functions here you saw from the memoize projection interface are for testing. And now the heavy lifting is done in the memoize function. This part here is also done for testing. So with NGRX 9, there was a mock store feature introduced into NGRX, which makes it possible to override specific selectors for testing without instantiating whole stores. So basically speeding up the whole test runs. If you're not yet using it, you really should have a look into it. And now the logic basically begins. So the first part, if we don't have anything yet, basically our memoization is called with the first set of arguments and we don't have a cached result or we don't have cached arguments yet, well, then we calculate the first result, basically taking the arguments and the projector function that is supplied to us. Then we're caching them. So here, last result and last arguments is basically our cache. And of course, we're returning the last result. So at this point here, we have been called at least once. Now, if the arguments are equal, using the is arguments equal check. So if they are equal, basically not changed, then we're just returning the last result. So we're not doing any calculation. We're just returning the last result because those calculations could actually be expensive, right? So if this is not the case, basically we have been called at least once and our arguments have changed in regards to the is arguments equal, then we're going to do the calculation and we're going to cache the new arguments. But still, we're not returning it yet, because now we're also checking if the result is equal. So maybe this is best explained with the code, why we actually need to do this last checking here before actually returning the new result. Because, so let's get back to this example here. So now you see why I actually broke this whole feature with the is arguments check, because if I use the true return here, basically this part here will always hit return the last result and not do any more calculation below. So this is why I actually broke the memoization with this statement here. And now let's go to the part of why I need to check the result. Well, imagine the following, that my projector function, so basically this part here, is always returning a new object that is semantically the same, but not identical to the first object. So, basic example here, I'm just doing a shallow copy of the object. This now leads to at least one update all the time, if a tag was added or if that wasn't added. Because you know, the default check is an identity check. And by doing a shallow copy, I create a new object every time in my projector function. So in turn, I also have to make sure that my selector doesn't fire for this. So, and here, this is where we use is results equal. So one example here, I'm not overriding the is arguments equal, but I am using a deep equal from Lodash. So let me put this here. Basically a deep equal from Lodash as the result check. And now I have practically repaired my selector again. And if I have this kind of thing, basically that I only want to override the result equal check, instead of default memoize, I can use result memoize, which only needs a result equal function. And we have the same behavior again. Cool, isn't it? So are there any questions about this? Because afterwards I would go to the example application that is broken, and then we're going to repair it. No questions? Okay. Then I have prepared another more elaborate example with some cards and some material styling, you know, the best I could do. I'm really more into the data part and NGRX of the applications. And what I'm using here is basically data views. So data views is basically a concept where you have seen the normalized data in the beginning. So I have an entity store for my books, I have an entity store for my text and for my authors. But what I really want to display is basically the data accumulated, like here. So I don't want to display the author ID here, I want to display the author name. So if we have a look at this part again, what we're basically doing. Yeah. So instead of using this getBook, I have another getBook selector that I have to import. So instead of basically supplying the data like this to the front end, where it has just the author IDs and the tag IDs, and also the publish date in just a number format, I'm now having a view which supplies the data in a more elaborate way. So the author IDs is replaced by an authors array where I can iterate through all of the entries, and also the tags are basically fetched from the other store and then projected into this data type. And also my published is no longer just a number, but an actual date object. So, and this is actually possible with selectors. So here you can see the example. So I'm fetching the book, I'm fetching authors of the book, which basically looks up in the author state. Yep. So basically looks up the author entities and the tag, the author IDs from the book, and then concatenates them together as an array. And the same is happening for the tags. But with this application, something is wrong here, right? So maybe you don't see it yet, but this flash actually resembles whenever the data behind of the book is changing. So, and I have a couple of buttons here that reset the data to its original demo data state. So basically, I'm pushing the same object or the same author by this push of the button into the store again. And here it's the same books, and here it's the same tags. As you can see, all of the data is basically updated. So obviously some problem with memoization. So what I always do when I see a problem like this, basically I have 3 books here. Yeah, let's just make it 1 book and see what happens. Maybe, you know, we want to pinpoint where the error actually is. So let's go to the books component. Here we have basically the actual selection. And now let's just take a slice with the first book. So now we just have 1 book. So let's see. If I update the author, it's flashing. If I update any tag, even unrelated tags, it's flashing. If I update the book, it's flashing. Oh, if I update another book, it's not flashing. So this tells me, by the way this data view is composed, if I'm updating a book, it can actually only be this selector or this input that is changing. So if it doesn't change for unrelated books, that means that this part is actually working. But for authors and for tags, the book is always updating. So problems must lie within those 2 selectors. So let's have a look. And here you see the projector function is always returning new objects. So basically, if I add any author, this is basically my dictionary of all of the authors. If I add any author object, this dictionary will change. I already verified that it can't be this getBook selector, which is being reduced here. So that means it's actually the projector function that will always output something new. So even if the data itself doesn't change, because filter is an immutable action, it will actually trigger a new object. So that means that the default identity check here is failing. Of course it is, because two arrays are not the same if they are created individually. So I need to go to some more elaborate check, maybe a deep equals, or maybe just a check that I have pre-composed here. So basically, if the arrays have the same length and every value is at the same position in either array, then I say they are equal. So now I can go ahead and just insert create selector factory here. I'm using default memorize. Oh, better result memorize. I just want to overwrite the result check. I have to give it the projector, and I'm using check equal as my check, basically. So, and now this one is flashing. That's okay, expected. This one is still working. Unrelated author, no longer checking. Related author, flashing. Looks good. So basically, I just had analyzed that my problem is actually the projector because it creates a new object every time. So as a recipe, I have to do something about the result memoization and just create a custom check here. And of course, the same is basically done, has to be done for the text. So I can just go ahead, copy this part, and unrelated tag, good. Unrelated tag, related tag. Looks good. Everything only updating when it's supposed to be. So, guess we can make the problem big again. 3 books. Let's check. Oh, something's still broken. If I now update the books, all of the books are being updated. But does it work for text? No, also doesn't work for text. This is the second, basically, the second part, because I am using memoization with props. And you can also already see a big hint in this file, because this is strike through, which means there has to be some kind of deprecation behind it. So the problem, basically, to elaborate here a bit, is actually in this position, right? So if I use a selector with props just once, that means that it was working, which we have seen if we were just using one book. But now we're reusing the same selector, so the same selector instance 3 times on this page. So, and as I've said before, one selector only provides one memoization stream. That basically means the first selector is doing all of the setup you have seen in the custom memoize with caching the inputs and storing the outputs. And then the second selector is reusing the same stream, overwriting all of the inputs and outputs. And the third one does it again. So that means if I use selector with props like this, more than once on my page, it can't actually be working because I can't reuse the same memoization stream. So instead, I have to go in here and actually have 3 selector instances. So we can do this by making this whole selector construct that we have here. We have to transform it into factories. So selector with props basically means that in my projector function, I take an addition argument in the projector and use it to compute my stuff. But the alternative way is to actually use it or so to actually create new selectors every time. So that way, not the same selector stream is being used, but I'm setting up individual streams per book ID, basically. So by doing this, I get a couple of compile errors, because now I'm pretty sure I have to change it here. So because the get book is now a selector factory, as you see here, all of the dependent selectors also have to be factories. And again, here it's a factory of a factory, but that doesn't hurt. Is it here? I have to use it here. And I think I also have to use it here. So still something wrong. Any hint? Ah, you know, live coding, you just gotta love it. Yeah, of course. In the book component, here I also have to use a factory now. And here we are again. So now I have transformed all of the selector with props to selectors that actually have individual streams. So each of those data behind all of those cards is using an individual stream. And now it's just the books updating that are actually being updated, and only the relevant data is actually being updated, as you can see here. So software engineering is both of those books, and philosophy are the outer ones. Yeah. So basically, we've repaired all of this. So recipe number 2, don't use selector with props. They are deprecated anyways. So eventually they will move away from the whole NGRX. So now there's still a third thing. So the add random tag to book, which is not working. So I would expect some additional text to actually be displayed here. But as you can see, there's an error in the console. In the normal browser console, you would see a stack trace now, which would lead you to a specific point. Exactly here. So that's basically where the error is. So cannot add property 2. Object is not extensible. That's because this part in the reducer, this is a mutable action. So if you see something like this in your daily programming life, the first thing you do is panic mode. The second thing you do, check if you're using runtime checks, because you should activate them, at least for development purposes. And then you can actually be lucky that you have NGRX entity here, because in development mode, NGRX entity is actually wrapping all of the entities that you use in your NGRX store. It's wrapping them with read-only in development mode. So this code that you saw here, this can actually go to production, and it compiles in production. Doesn't work, but it compiles. So if you actually, so basically the importance of immutability is important here. So we need all of our stuff in our reducers to be immutable, because as you saw earlier, the selectors, they base on identity checks most of the time by default anyways. So if you're doing mutable actions in the reducer, your selectors won't actually catch any changes because of the identity checks. You can, however, work like this if you use a library called immer and also the appropriate wrappers that embed them into NGRX. So if we're now having a look here, this is what we actually want to see. So tags are being added, and this actually works. So immer is basically a wrapper around this, this part of the reducer, which creates a deep copy of the state object. So you can mutably edit it, and then you just return the new state. And immer basically takes care of all of the copy on write actions that you are doing. So actually pretty helpful. But of course, it comes with the cost of an additional library. So if you don't want that, you can just go the old-fashioned way and actually correctly use the entity state adapter and push an update. Of course, you have to do a lot of navigating and casting and spreading to actually add a tag ID at the right place at the right time. Still, this is the out-of-the-box solution, or at least somewhat. An example, basically. So, and with this, we basically have repaired our application. And I think the next one is the basically the slide about all of the clues and recipes. So first one here, don't use selector with props. They are deprecated, just don't use them, especially if you use the same selector with multiple properties on the same page, you see that memoization is broken. So this is a part that is actually hidden in the NGRX documentation over a long time now. But by now, so with NGRX 12, you will see that selector with props is being deprecated, and it will soon move out. So then we have a second case that I haven't actually portrayed here in this small application. If you have a selector with quite a lot of inputs, it is good to actually partition this big selector into smaller selectors. Because you have seen there is a selector will always do a computation of the projector if any input changes. And if there is a lot of inputs, so a lot of dependencies to this one selector, it will probably always trigger the calculation in the projector. So it's actually better to partition this into smaller selectors, which you then again use result memoize for to actually do the memoization. Then I think, as you have seen with the get author of books and the create get text of books, you can have projectors that always create new objects. This is just the thing. If you're using array methods like filter or slice, they will always yield a new array. So there is nothing you can do but really go into result memoization and then do a proper custom check. And of course, last but not least, immutability has to be preserved at all costs. So use libraries like immer if you want to have a kind of iterative reducer actions. But there's always an out-of-the-box solution. It's just a bit more code. So now that we've prepared or repaired this application, this is again like a good checkpoint for questions. Otherwise, I have prepared another example where we go basically from mechanic to car designer.
Danilo.
Yeah.
How did you came across IMO, the library?
Just by chance, basically. I caught this up somewhere. So basically, that you could have wrappers around your specific Angular artifacts. So let's have a look at NGRX minus immer, for example.
Basically, did you need to solve any issues on these?
No, not really. I was aware about the last part here. I have seen this from NGRX, etc. It's basically a utility library where a lot of NGRX stuff is bundled on. I knew there was something called like mutable on. So something that actually enables us to do like mutable actions, and that there is somewhat a library that actually helps me that I can do this. So basically that helps with all of the deep copy of the state, and then I can do mutable actions on my stuff. And yeah, of course, for this talk, I somewhat needed an example where a mutable action or a mutable interaction with the store was being done to actually showcase that you could do it. And then I came basically back to this one, and then this one, basically. So yeah, as you can see, I have just showcased the immer on, which is basically just this small part of the reducer. You can have a whole reducer created with an immer wrapper or whole stores. Yeah.
Yeah, the names are quite weird to read for Germans.
You think so? No idea what you're talking about. Okay, let's go with a custom Memoize demo. So this is basically still the same application. Just have to do some configuration here. And in this application, everything is already fixed. So yeah. Yeah, this is also part of the GitHub project. So the application in the state that I've just currently showcased it, and also the fixed state where you can then compare how we have done all of the repairs. So let's go with this fixed application, not this one, this one. And I think I also need to push the fork button. Yes. So now we're good to go. So let's imagine you have some, or you want to do some expensive calculation in your data view. For example, if a book is new or if it isn't new. And let's also imagine that this calculation, for whatever reason, depends on Fibonacci numbers. So for example, business requirements, don't question them. This new calculation is based on take the first 2 digits of the year and the last 2 digits, add them together, calculate the Fibonacci number, and if that number is greater than 100 million, the book is new. This happens at number 39. So basically every book from 2019 on will be new. And also every book from the year 1920 till 1999. So, business requirements. Let's just say we have an expensive calculation and we want to reduce the amount of how often we actually calculate it. And memoization can actually help us with this. So now I've just added this new property here in my get book view selector. So which means it's part of the projector. So every time the projector is called, this calculation is being done. So this again means this calculation is being done whenever some of the inputs change. So if tags of this specific book or authors of this book are added or if the book changes of some kind. So basically, every time something changes, this calculation will be done again. And this is something that we actually don't want to have, right? So as we've seen earlier, we can just use Memoize and wrap it around this function. So now I've reduced the calculations a bit, you can see, but still, if the book changes, the calculation is being done again. And just by business logic, we know that it's based on the year of the publishing of the book. We know that we don't change the year in our application. So basically, we can pinpoint this calculation to the actual ID of the book, right? So we can use Memoize. Memoize has a second argument where I can actually tell Memoize on what property or what hash it actually should Memoize on. So I'm just giving it the book, and I say book.id. And now we have calculations for every book at the start of the application, and then no more calculations after this. Even if we leave the page and re-enter it again, no more new calculation. So as far as implementation style goes, this is a really good, acceptable solution. But of course, it does have really nothing to do with NGRX. So let's go with something more interesting here. We want to solve this with NGRX. So the first thing that we have to do, basically, we have to put the isNew in a selector. So a new selector that is being used in this selector here. So I'm just adding the boilerplate basically here. And now I have to do const isNew. It has to be a selector, a factory that is dependent on the book ID. And it uses create selector. Our input is the book. So we are reusing the get book selector with the book ID. And our projector, well, it's our calculate function, right? So save, all the typing good. We see 3 calculations, no new calculations here, but whenever we change the book, a new calculation is being done. Yeah, of course, because the book is actually changing. So we need to tell, or we need to customize the argument for is arguments equal from the default Memoize, which we do by using create factors, selector factory. Then we do the whole bit with using default Memoize and giving it the projector. And now we know we just have this one input. So in the is arguments equal, we're actually only comparing books. So we have A and B as books. And we say they are equal when their IDs are equal. And now, no updates here. That's good. Or no calculations here. And no calculations here. So this actually works. It's not quite the same, because if I leave this page and go back to the page again, the calculation is being done again. That happens because everything here is basically a factory. If I leave the page, all of my selectors or all of my observables are being unsubscribed. And then if I re-enter the page, I'm resubscribing to them again. So by the way, this is using factories. We can't actually implement what we want to implement like this. So now, as I promised, let's get car designers, and we're actually doing our own custom memoization. So memoize. And as we've seen earlier from default memoize is implementing a memoize function. It's basically a function that takes a projector and returns a memoize projection. So now we have to implement the interface. I'm just doing no ops here because we only need those for testing. And reset, I think, yes. And now the heavy lifting is being done in the memoize function. Save, compiles, very good. So now let's see. What do we actually have? So let's have a look at the arcs. Well, as you would expect, in my actual memoized function, I'm getting the individual books. So all of the book data that is used for actually calculating the memoization result. In this case, it's only one argument because we only have one argument here. So for example, if I were to have two input selectors, I also get two arguments in my memoized function. So here you see the author basically. But we just need the book and basically the year of the book. So one argument is actually fine. So projector, what is actually the projector? Well, let's call it with the arguments. And we see, well, the projector is actually this projector function here. And if we're doing the calculation with our arguments, well, we see false, true, and false. So basically what we actually want to display here. So now that we know that, all we need is a cache object. We know this is a book. Now we're doing the lookup. If the cache of book ID is available, or if it is not available, and we calculate. So taking this, and we're using the projector, calling it with the book. Now we know it is available, so we just return it. So, and as you can see, I have the result here. But now the question is memoization working correctly? And is it only calculating? Yeah, so all good here. Leaving the page, re-entering the page. Still does a recalculation. Yeah, well, because the memoization is basically reused again. So I guess we just have to move the cache out of this memoization function. And now back onto the page again. No new calculation. So now I have basically effectively globally memoized my calculation. And for each and every application lifetime, it will only be calculated once. So, and we have done that basically with a custom memoization using create selector factory. Yeah, so this is a constructed example, of course. I haven't actually had a case yet where I actually needed to do stunts like this, but maybe you do. And I hope this helps. So now we're nearing the end of the presentation, and I guess there was quite a lot of input already. So here's some links to some blog articles that I have based this talk on. Also have a look at the actual NGRX platform code, because basically everything that I navigated through code-wise today is actually in this one file. And also you can have a look at why the selector with props is being deprecated. So there is a really long request for comments that is actually accepted. And yeah, just on the last low-memoize, basically the utility that I've used in the beginning, and immer, which we also had a question about. So thank you for your attention. And all of the slides are available at my GitHub account in the Meetup NGRX Selector Memoization project. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot, Danilo. It was very interesting. Yeah, we learned a lot, I think. So now there's still maybe some questions. I think we can still take some time also for questions. If there's any question, please just open the mic and talk now. Well, if there's no question right now, I would have a question. So this customization of memoization and other all the options that you showed, is that something that you use a lot in your applications? I mean, do you come across a lot of places where this is really needed? Or
yeah, so exactly this this way of using result memoize, for example. So we have a lot of cases where we have a normalized API and we have to basically concatenate data from different points, and then we use array filter quite a lot to actually compose those objects. And yeah, there we have the problem that those are creating new objects all of the time. So we have a lot of places that actually use result memoize with an array check. Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense.
Most of the other examples are somewhat constructed. so in
no
our
application,
yeah, this works. Yeah, but for example, we had a lot of discussion about using selector with props. I'm really glad that they're now being deprecated, because we were using them at the beginning, and then some of the problems were really evident, as exactly with the memoization. So we got rid of them, and now they're gone forever. This is a good thing.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Well, any other questions? Okay, then I think we can close this. Yeah, thanks again. Thanks a lot. Very interesting. And yeah, we will share the video. We already have the code and the slides on the Meetup page. So as soon as the video is ready, we would also share it. And well, hope to see you next time then. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Danilo.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was very nice.
Bye.
And
Bye-bye.
congratulations for the presentation.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thanks.